Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, beautiful community. It's been a while since we did a live, and so I wanted to take a moment to sort of like tune in, check back in with you, and share a little bit about the current market conditions. However, today we're not going to go fully into the nitty-gritty, but what I do want to talk about is how much money do you actually need to be able to afford a home today? So I came across this article the other day, and I thought that it was very interesting how they laid out a list of all 50 states and the cost of a starter home versus how much money do you need to be making in order to be able to afford one of these homes. Now, for those who are brand new into the whole real estate, a starter home is not the same thing as your dream home. So a starter home is basically that home that you get to buy for the first time with the savings that you can afford. Sometimes that starter home can also be your dream house, but it's usually not in the majority of the cases. Starter homes are usually for those young professionals who manage to save and they're working to purchase that very first home, or for a young family who have small children and then they manage to save some money and they manage to buy something for themselves. And so starter homes could be moving ready, but a little dated, or they can be just moving ready, but not necessarily in the neighborhood that you desire to live in 100%. So I just wanted to keep that in mind because the table that we're going to review in a few may contain some prices that are a little bit different to some expectations, and to a certain degree it might seem incredible depending on the area. So just wanted to keep that into perspective, and what I wanted to do is just to come here and share this table right here. So the article is one that I came across from Realtor.com, and I just need to make sure that the translator is removed because we were just doing a live in the Hispanic channel. Okay, so courtesy of Realtor.com, and the topic around this area is what is the minimum income that you need to afford a starter home at a 7% mortgage rate. In fact, for those who needed to verify or corroborate that information, I also have this website here, Mortgage News Daily, which is the same website that all the lenders check in to determine the rates that are in the market. And so it's still in the same ballpark, somewhere between 6.8 to 6.95%, depending on the type of loan that you're looking to apply. So coming back to the article, the first step I want to make is this one right here on the heat map. So let me just zoom out a little bit to allow a nicer visibility for everybody. And so when you look at this heat map right here, it is not surprising to see that the colors will change and they will get darker or deeper or richer, depending on the word that you want to use, in the coast, right? So the map shows a range of salaries that are needed to be able to afford that starter home, starting at $31,653. That's the minimum salary required to be able to afford a starter home, and it goes up all the way to $167,199. And so, like I mentioned before, it is no surprise that the states that are in the central areas of the country will usually require a less salary because the cost of living is a lot more affordable in comparison to the major states or the major cities like California, New York, New Jersey, and even in parts of Florida. Now we're seeing that it's trending more towards the higher requirement salary. I think it has to do mainly with the migration that happened during the pandemic. A lot of people from the more expensive states, for example, California, that migrated to Texas, and then New Yorkers and people from New Jersey migrating all the way down south to Florida. So that's just to give you a little preview of what's the spec. Now, what I want to do now is to go through the table, and this section is gonna get a little lengthier right here, and so bear with me. And so the way I wanted to go over the table is that this table has a lot of columns, but I'm not interested in going through all columns. Like you might have seen, the title of this episode is how much money or how much salary do you need to have or do you need to make in order to afford your primary home. Once again, the primary home is not the same as your dream home. Is that first home that you can afford with what you have. And so what we're going to do, we're going to review how much of it does it change or how much do you need of it per state, the average cost of a starter home, and the minimum income required. And once again, depending on the area, you might see that some of these prices doesn't agree with the city where you live in. But just bear in mind that although a state could have a reputation of being expensive, not all cities have the same cost of living. Okay, so let's just start with the list. Again, I'm going to go through all 50 states. This could feel a little lengthy, but I have seen some comments where subscribers are mentioning that, hey, I tend to talk a lot about Florida and New York. What about giving some love to the other states? So this is kind of like my way to give love to the other states. Okay, so let's just get started. We're going to focus on the geography, the cost of the starter home, and the minimum income required. So starting with Alabama, the cost of a starter home is averaging somewhere at $225,520. And in order to afford a home at that price range, you will need a minimum salary of $54,014. Now, when I talk about the income required, I'm not talking about the income generated by one person, because we do have married couples who apply to mortgages together. We have domestic partners, or we have just business partners that do apply on a loan altogether. So the income that I'm referring to in this case is the combined income, and it's not just generated by one person. That's great if you can't afford to buy a home by yourself, but just bear in mind that if you're not in this situation, you can also combine those incomes in order to afford that. Okay, so moving along to Alaska, the cost of a starter home is $293,100, and the minimum income required is $70,200. Then moving along to Arizona, we can see the average starter home price go up a little bit to $395,520, and that will require hence a higher annual income in order to afford that. Now, you might wonder, why am I focusing on the relationship between home price and income? Just remember that when you apply for a mortgage, lenders, they do ask to see your pay stub to verify that you're still, have that job and that you're still receiving income. But they also ask for copies of your tax return because they want to get a ballpark of how much you make annually. And then based on that, usually you will get somewhere between 3 to 4 times of that annual income. Obviously, you can qualify for less or more depending on your FICO score, your debt to income ratio, and all of that. But usually the ballpark, it's based on how much money you generate on an annual basis, which is why I'm emphasizing the relationship between the cost of the starter home with the minimum annual income that needs to be generated. Okay, so now moving to Arkansas. The cost of a starter home goes down to $183,850, and it will require a minimum income of $44,034. Then we move to California, and then the average cost of a starter home is $497,780, and it will require an average minimum salary or income of $119,223. I'm going to pause here because I do anticipate people saying, hey, those numbers are not realistic. Something must be wrong with the study. Remember, California is a very big state. Not all of California is LA and San Francisco, although I know it's easier to think that it's just those two cities. But if you go further out, not all the places in California are as expensive as those big cities. So you have to keep that into consideration. And remember, this is an average. This is an average of starter homes. And although what we see in the news are mainly those $1 million houses, not every single starter home is worth $1 million. So just keep that in mind. And please remember that this is just an average. Now going to Colorado, $477,000 and it will require a minimum salary or income of $114,253. Moving along to Connecticut, so that price goes down a little bit, but it's still up there, especially because of its proximity to New York City. So I do, in fact, know a lot of people who commute back and forth between Connecticut and New York City for their jobs. So a starter home averages $390,090, and the minimum income required to be able to afford a starter home in Connecticut is $93,430. Then we move on to the state of Delaware, where the starter home is in the range of $405,400, and it will require a minimum salary of or income of $97,097. Then there's District of Columbia, or DC. And then, so the starter home over there, I will say it's probably the highest in this list at $583,750, and it will require a minimum income of $139,813. Then we go to Florida. That's where I invest. The typical starter home ranges somewhere between $360,540, and they require minimum income will be $86,353. Even for me, $360,000 is a little high based on my experience. But like I said, I know it's an average. They're probably factoring in those $1 million mansion that could be starter home for some families. But yeah, that's not the pricing that I am used to for a single family, but I know they're out there, okay? Georgia, $299,350, that's the average, and then it will require a minimum income of $71,697. We're somewhat halfway through the list, so bear with me. Hawaii, thank you for tuning in, Hawaii. The starter home in Hawaii, in fact, I was wrong, the highest one is in Hawaii, is $698,090, and it will require a minimum income of $167,199. Then we move on to Idaho at $426,130 for a starter home, and the required salary will be $102,062. Keep in mind I use salary and income interchangeably because salary could be just one person and income could be multiple people, okay? Now, Illinois, prices go down a little bit, and now we're talking about $160,200 for a starter home. Not just a little, actually, it goes down by a lot. So the cost of living in Illinois is much cheaper, and therefore it translates to a lower requirement in terms of income at $38,369. And then Indiana, $190,370, and a minimum income required to be able to afford a starter home is $45,595. Then we have Iowa at $174,310 with a minimum income of $41,749. Then we got Kansas over here, and Kansas is sitting at $170,890 for the starter home cost. And the salary that you will need to make or generate to afford a home there is sitting at $40,930. Then we have Kentucky for $217,030, and the minimum salary or income required will be $51,981. Now we move on to Louisiana, and the cost does go down a little bit for a primary home, for a starter home, and it's ranging at $195,200, and the salary is sitting at $46,752. Then we talk about Maine. It goes up a little bit to $266,120 for a starter home, and the minimum salary required to be able to afford a home in that price range is $63,738. Then we go over to Maryland, and the price of a starter home does go up to $368,780 with an average minimum income of $88,326. Now we go back to the higher cost of living. So let's go to Massachusetts. An average starter home is sitting at $562,560 with a salary, a minimum income required of $134,738. Then we got Michigan, $150,790, and then the annual income required to afford a home in Michigan is sitting at $36,116. Now, let's talk about Minnesota, $293,910, and the average minimum income required to afford a home in Minnesota at that price range is $70,394. Mississippi, 184,470, and the average minimum salary required to afford a home at that price range is $44,182. Then we go on to Missouri. It's somewhere between the same ballpark, sitting at $188,480, and a minimum salary required $45,143. So we're getting through halfway through the list. Thank you for your patience if you're still waiting for your state, and thank you for tuning in if you already checked out your state. Montana, we have here, it's sitting at $401,460. And the salary required to afford a home of that price range is $96,153. Bear in mind that I keep repeating the phrase starting home and the minimum salary required because I don't know at what point in time in the video you're tuning in, so I want to make sure that you don't get lost and you're probably wondering, hey, what the heck do these numbers mean, right? And so if you have been tuning in for quite some time now, welcome. And then if you just tuned in now, thank you and welcome. So let's move on to Nevada. And so at Nevada, we have $434,630 for the starter home. And the minimum salary required to afford that starter home ranges somewhere between $104,098. Then we have New Hampshire sitting at $434,160. And then the minimum income required to afford a house of that price is $103,985. Now, moving on to New Jersey, $423,540, and then a minimum income required of $101,442. Then we have New Mexico sitting at $294,200 for the starter home, and the minimum income required is $70,464. Now, New York, and this one is going to be tricky. So New York is sitting, surprisingly, at $335,230, and it requires a minimum salary of $80,291. And I know, depending on where you live, whether you live in New York City or in upstate New York, you might find these numbers to be outrageous, because if you are in New York City, you will find this price to be ridiculously low. Because if you go on Zillow or on Realtor.com, you realize the majority of the prices here in New York City are way above that price range. However, let me remind you that New York is a large state, and if you drive 2 hours up north past New York City, you'll realize that the properties up there is a lot more affordable. So the pricing that we're seeing here, it's on the average of all of New York State. It's not just New York City. And even if you find that surprisingly hard to believe, you can still find a nice studio apartment in New York City for $333,000 or $300,000. It would just need a little bit of, TLC on your end, a lot of decorating, renovation, just to, make it look pretty, but they're out there, okay? You just have to look closer. Now, moving on to North Carolina, the price of a starter home is sitting at $314,880, and the minimum salary required is sitting at $75,416. Then we have North Dakota sitting at $231,480 for a starter home, and the minimum salary required is $55,442 for you to be able to afford a home in that price range. Moving to Ohio, now the price range drops to $164,570, and the minimum salary required is sitting at $39,416. Then in Oklahoma, we're talking about $198,560 for the starter home, and then the minimum salary required is $47,557. Moving along to Oregon, and we're almost coming to the end, but not quite. So in Oregon, that's kind of like the new California for some people. A lot of Californians are migrating up there, the quality of living, the trendiness and everything. So if you're up there in Oregon, congrats. Your area is up and coming. And if you're considering moving out of California and you want something that could replace your style and the way of living, Oregon might be worth checking for you, okay? So the cost of a starter home up in Oregon is $442,060, and then the minimum income required for a home there is $105,877. Now, moving along to Pennsylvania, we're coming down on pricing again, so it's setting at $186,050 for a starter home, and then the average salary needed to afford a home at that price range is $44,561. Now we move on to Rhode Island. Now the prices come back up again at $407,720 for a starter home, needing a minimum income of $97,653. Then we head to the Carolinas, but this time to South Carolina, and the requirement there for a starter home is $68,940 for your salary to be able to afford a house in the range of $287,840. In South Dakota, it's similar in the price. We're talking about a starter home going for $287,500 and a minimum salary of $68,859. Up in Tennessee, or down in Tennessee, because I'm in New York. So down in Tennessee, $310,960 for a starter home, and the minimum income required is sitting at $74,478. And then in Texas, we're talking about $274,260 for a starter home with a minimum salary of $65,688. In Utah, we're sitting at $518,570 with a minimum salary required of $124,202. In Vermont, we're talking about starter home ranging somewhere at $338,040 with a minimum income required $80,964. And then once again, I use salary and income interchangeably because you could be one person making that much money, congratulations, and buying your house, or you can be a couple, or you can be partners that are involved in the same transaction. So it's income overall, but I'm using both interchangeably to make it more inclusive. So in Virginia, a starter home, it's going for $305,260, and the minimum income required is $73,112. With Washington, we're talking about $482,900, and this is Washington State, up in Seattle, right? Like, well, Seattle, it's in Washington State. This is not Washington, D.C. And then the minimum income required, it's setting at $115,659. Then we have West Virginia with a starter home at $132,160 with a minimum income required of $31,653. Then we have Wisconsin sitting at $256,670 with a minimum income required sitting at $61,475. And this is also great for those who are living in other states but are looking for a more affordable alternative to invest in real estate. So this list will give you a good comparison on where to look and where to start building your power team in the event that you want to invest out of state and make your money's worth. And last on the list, we have Wyoming with a starter home going for $319,640 and a minimum required salary sitting at $76,577. Okay, so that's in terms of this listing. And I wanted to take this moment to also talk about things that are non-conventional. So let's say, for example, the list that we just went over, it's specifically talking about the income that people would generate with their W-2. But we also know that we have a very diverse community that is tuning in with us. And we do know that some of you are business owners and some of you are 1099 workers, and that doesn't necessarily put you in the position that you can qualify for traditional financing. For those who are brand new to real estate, traditional financing means loans that fit the standard population, loans that are backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and you need to kind of like fit into the more generic requirement in order to qualify for those type of loans. And so I wanted to provide some options for those who fall outside of that category. And so one of those loans that you can actually leverage are DSCR loans, but they're created mainly for investors. So a DSCR loan comes in very handy because it doesn't go by your annual income. It ignores your personal income, and the loan, it's approved to you based on how much the property is generated. So let's say if you have a property that you're interested in buying and is generating a good rental income, so the lender will take the rental income into consideration to determine whether you can actually afford the property or not. What they need to do is to make sure that the DSCR is met, meaning the ratio. So they need to see that the income that is generating, that property is generating, can in fact cover the mortgage obligation. And if it does, then you got yourself a mortgage right there. But again, those are not for primary residence. Those are mainly for investor loans. Now, if you are in the position where you are a business owner, what happens usually with business owners? That you generate income with your property, but you don't generally pay yourself a high salary because you take that money and you reinvest it back into the company because you want to keep pushing your company and make it grow. So what happens is you are making money, but you're not making money at the same time based to traditional standards. So your W-2 is very low. It wouldn't allow you to afford that home that you're seeking to buy, whether it's a starter home or whether it's just the home of your dreams. So for those type of consumers, there's something called non-QM loans. Why is it called a non-QM? Well, because you're falling outside of what's usually traditional, what's usually qualified to be backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So the lenders that offer those type of products, they sort of kind of like make an exception, and they look into your business income, but then they lend to you as a person, as an individual. And so we recently qualified for a loan like that. It was actually a first time for us. And so the experience was quite interesting. What they require from us was, obviously the application. And then they asked for 12 months worth of bank statements from our business. If you have some experience in the mortgage industry or applying for mortgage, you'll realize that the typical requirement for residential loans are somewhere 2 to 6 months of bank statements, sometimes 3 to 6 months. But in this case, they requested 12 months. Why? Because you're viewed as a more risky candidate. Because you're not being backed by the traditional mortgage, let's say, players, Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so they want to make sure that they have a full 12-year of business history. And so that's why they ask for your business bank statements, because they want to look back 12 months to see how is this business doing? Like, do they receive enough revenue? Do they generate enough income to even cover the mortgage? Is this consistent? Or are they getting paid like once every 3 to 4 months? Because if that's the case, the lenders don't want to see that. They want to see consistent income. That's why they prefer W-2, because it's consistent. You get paid bi-weekly, sometimes twice a month, and depending on the projects that you do, right? And so we did go through the lending process. It is very similar to a traditional mortgage, with the only difference that they did not require, they didn't ask for a personal tax return, and therefore they didn't request for IRS transcripts. But other than that, you still needed to provide a letter justifying certain movements in your bank account. And yeah, with the difference that instead of providing up to 6 months, this time you had to provide a full-blown bank statement. So I'm going to pause right here. I think we've covered enough for now, and I'm going to open up the floor to some questions if anybody has any questions. If not, I guess I'll just see you guys in the next live.
You can just put the questions in the comment section, and we'll be on the lookout for that.
So I don't see any questions. I do see people tuned in, so I guess I must have done a great job at explaining, and no one has any questions. So if that's the case, I'm gonna just give myself a pat on the shoulder. But if for whatever reason you did miss the live and you do have questions, but you don't happen to be tuned in into the live, feel free to leave questions down in the comment section, and I will check in from time to time, and I will do my best to provide a useful answer to you. So for those who are actually tuned in, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for the opportunity and sharing your time with me today. And I'll be seeing you in the next live. Voila.
Take care. See you.
Bye-bye.